Layoffs rarely tell you where a company's problems begin. They tell you where they finally become impossible to ignore. That's why I don't think Xbox's latest restructuring is really a story about layoffs. I think it's the final consequence of decisions that began years ago. A story of rapid expansion, ambitious acquisitions, and a story that gradually became more difficult to sustain. Within hours of the announcement, people already seemed to know why it happened. AI, outsourcing, corporate greed, even the Activision acquisition. But after looking through Microsoft's restructuring plans, Xbox's financial performance, and everything that led to this moment, I don't think the layoffs are actually the story. I think they're simply the point where years of strategic decisions finally became impossible to ignore. Xbox's latest round of layoffs quickly became one of the biggest stories in gaming. Thousands of jobs were gone, studios were affected, projects disappeared, and almost immediately, the conversation shifted away from what had happened to why it had happened. At first, that seems perfectly reasonable. When a company announces one of the largest restructurings in its history, people naturally want an explanation. The interesting part wasn't that people were asking questions, it was how quickly they became convinced they already had the answer. Spend a few minutes scrolling through Reddit and one explanation starts dominating the discussion. Open Twitter and you'll find a completely different one. Watch a few YouTube videos and you'll hear several more. Some argued AI had finally begun replacing developers. Others blamed the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Some pointed to Game Pass and questioned whether the business model had become too expensive to sustain. Others focused on the H-1B visas, which is an employer-sponsored non-immigrant visa that allows US companies to temporarily employ foreign workers, or other areas such as outsourcing or Microsoft's broader strategy. At first glance, almost all of these explanations sound plausible, and that's exactly why they spread so quickly, because each one focuses on something real. Xbox did spend nearly $70 billion acquiring Activision Blizzard. Microsoft is investing heavily in AI. Game Pass has become one of Xbox's biggest long-term bets. Hardware sales have struggled compared to previous generations, but none of these observations are entirely wrong. But that's also what makes stories like this so difficult. Complex business decisions rarely have a single cause. Instead, they leave behind enough evidence for multiple explanations to sound convincing. If you believe AI is the story, you'll find evidence to support it. If you think the Activision acquisition is to blame, you'll find evidence for that too. If you believe Game Pass created an unsustainable business model, there are numbers that seem to support that argument as well. The real question isn't whether any of those factors mattered, it's whether any of them can explain everything that happened. The more I looked at the discussion, the more one thing stood out. Everyone seemed determined to find the reason behind the layoffs, as though a company employing tens of thousands of people spread across dozens of studios and multiple continents could be explained by a single headline. That struck me as surprisingly strange, because companies don't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to remove thousands of jobs. Decisions like that are usually the result of years of pressure slowly building beneath the surface. Pressure that eventually reaches a point where doing nothing is no longer an option. And that's when I started wondering if we were looking at Xbox layoffs the wrong way. Maybe the layoffs weren't really the beginning. Maybe they were simply the moment everything that had been building beneath the surface finally became visible. So if the layoffs weren't really the beginning of the story, then where did it begin? The more I look back over Xbox's strategy during the last decade, the more one thing became clear. This wasn't a company thinking about the next console anymore. It was trying to redefine what Xbox actually was. Looking back, I think Microsoft's entire strategy can almost be summarized by the infamous famous words, "This is an Xbox." Microsoft wasn't simply advertising another console. The campaign reflected a much broader strategy, one where Xbox was no longer defined by a single piece of hardware, but by an ecosystem that could exist across consoles, PC, cloud, and mobile. At first, it sounded like another marketing campaign, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it represented something much bigger. For years, Xbox had been built around a single piece of hardware. Now, Microsoft was telling players that Xbox could be a console, a PC, a phone, a handheld, the cloud, even Game Pass, almost anywhere you wanted to play. That wasn't just a different way of marketing Xbox, it was a completely different vision for the business, and on paper, it made perfect sense. Gaming was changing, subscriptions were growing, cloud technology was improving, players were increasingly spread across different devices. Simply selling another console was never going to be enough, so Xbox kept expanding. It invested heavily in Game Pass, it acquired Bethesda, then Activision Blizzard. It brought together some of the biggest franchises in gaming gaming under one company. Looking from the outside, it's easy to understand why many people believe the Xbox had never been stronger, but that's also where the story starts becoming more complicated, because growth doesn't just create opportunity. Every new layer of growth also creates another layer of complexity, and eventually complexity becomes something that has to be managed just as carefully as growth itself. And every acquisition, every studio, every new layer you add brings its own leadership, its own development pipelines, its own culture, its own technology. Every new studio doesn't just add games, it adds people, leadership, technology, production pipelines, and even expectations. And none of those decisions were necessarily mistakes. In fact, you could argue that almost every one of them made sense individually. The challenge was that they were no longer individual decisions, they had all become part of the same business. A business that had become significantly larger, more expensive to operate, and increasingly difficult to coordinate. Suddenly, Microsoft's announcement starts looking very different. The layoffs weren't the only change. The company also announced a flatter management structure, fewer organizational layers, a renewed focus on fewer priorities, and a broader effort to simplify how Xbox operates. The impact of that complexity became visible almost immediately after the restructuring. Reports from IGN described widespread concern across Bethesda, with teams connected to franchises like The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Doom affected by the cuts, raising questions about delays, production capacity, and the long-term impact on some of Xbox's biggest studios. That's why I don't think restructuring is just another corporate buzzword. When you look at everything together, it starts feeling less like a company trying to cut costs and more like a company trying to make itself manageable again. Even industry coverage began framing the restructuring as something larger than another round of layoffs. Rather than focusing solely on the job cuts, much of the discussion shifted toward the long-term consequences of Xbox's expansion strategy following the Activision Blizzard acquisition, which raises a much more interesting question. If Xbox spent years building this version of the business, why did so many people immediately reduce the entire story to a single explanation? There's something interesting about the way we react to stories like this. Whenever a major company announces thousands of layoffs, the conversation almost immediately shifts toward one question. What caused it? Not one of the causes, the cause. It's an understandable reaction. A company the size of Xbox isn't shaped by one decision. It's shaped by hundreds of decisions made over years by people working toward different goals. That's exactly what makes stories like this so difficult to explain. Most of us don't spend our time thinking about operating margins, organizational structures, or long-term corporate strategy. So when something dramatic happens, our brains naturally start looking for a reason that feels easy to understand. A consequence, a strategic decision that led to this outcome. Just one decision, one executive, one acquisition, or one mistake. And that's exactly what happened with the Xbox. Depending on where you looked, the explanation seemed obvious. Some blamed AI, others blamed the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Some argued Game Pass had become unsustainable. Others focused on outsourcing or H-1B visas. What's interesting isn't that those conversations happened, it's that every one of them captured part of the picture, while quietly treating it as a whole picture. That's a trap we fall into surprisingly often. Complex events rarely have simple causes, but simple explanations are easier to share, they're easy to debate, and they're much easier to remember, which is exactly why they spread so quickly. Eventually, Microsoft felt the need to respond publicly through communications chief Frank Shaw, pushing back against several of the narratives circulating online. In particular, he argued that claims surrounding H-1B visas and the replacement of American workers misrepresented what had actually happened, emphasizing that the visa figures reflected Microsoft as a whole rather than Xbox specifically. What's interesting isn't deciding who was right, it's realizing that conversation had already become focused on assigning blame, and that's very different from understanding why Xbox needed a reset in the first place. Whether that changes anyone's opinion isn't really the point. What interests me is that Microsoft felt the need to respond at all, because by that point, the conversation had already moved beyond restructuring. People weren't simply trying to understand what had happened. They were trying to decide which explanation deserved the blame, and I think that's where the discussion quietly changed. The more I looked at everything surrounding Xbox's restructuring, the less interested I became in finding one reason, because the evidence kept pointing somewhere else, not toward one decision, but instead towards years of decisions gradually creating a business that eventually needed to change, which raises one final question. If the layoffs weren't really the story and no single decision explains them, what was Microsoft actually trying to fix? Microsoft gave its internal memo a surprisingly simple title, Resetting Xbox. The more I thought about those two words, the more I realized they answered almost every question this restructuring had raised, because companies don't usually talk about resetting a business when they're simply trying to reduce costs. They use that kind of language when they're trying to change how the business itself operates, and that's exactly what Microsoft's announcement described. The layoffs were only a part of it. The company also outlined a flatter management structure, fewer organizational layers, a renewed focus on fewer priorities, and a broader effort to simplify how Xbox operates. Taken individually, those changes might not seem particularly remarkable. Together, they paint a very different picture. This wasn't simply about making Xbox smaller, it was about making Xbox manageable again. Looking back, that actually makes sense. Over the last decade, Xbox had transformed from a console business into something far more ambitious. It had become a platform spanning console, PC, cloud, subscriptions, mobile gaming, and dozens of first-party studios. That transformation created incredible opportunities, but it also created an organization that had become significantly larger, more expensive, and far more complex than the Xbox of a decade ago. At some point, growth stops becoming the biggest challenge. Managing that growth becomes the challenge. And that's a transition many companies eventually have to make. Building something is one challenge. Learning how to sustain it is another entirely. And I think that's exactly what Microsoft finally reached. Even industry coverage like IGN increasingly began describing the moment as an Xbox reset rather than simply another round of layoffs, reflecting a growing recognition that Microsoft wasn't just reducing headcount, it was attempting to reshape how the business operated. That's why I don't think this restructuring should be viewed as an admission that Xbox's ambitions were wrong. Viewed in isolation, many of those decisions were logical responses to where the industry was heading. The challenge only became visible once all of those decisions had to coexist within the same business. The challenge wasn't ambition, it was making an increasingly ambitious business sustainable over the long term. And I think that's an important distinction, because once you look at the restructuring through that lens, the layoffs stop looking like a story. They start looking like one consequence of a company trying to redefine how it moves forward. So, were the layoffs ever really the story? I don't think they were. The layoffs were the most visible part of what happened. They were the headlines, the numbers, the difficult conversations, the human cost of a company going through one of the biggest restructurings in its history. But they were also the easiest part of the story to see. The harder part was everything that happened before them. Years of expansions, acquisitions, years of redefining what Xbox was trying to become. Individually, many of those decisions made sense. Gaming was changing, players were changing, and even the industry itself was changing. Xbox wasn't standing still, it was trying to adapt, but over time, that ambition created something else, a business that became larger, more interconnected, and far more complex than it had ever been before. I think that's why so many of the conversations surrounding these layoffs felt incomplete. They searched for one decision, one mistake, or an explanation, but businesses rarely change because of one moment. They change because hundreds of decisions made over years gradually reshape what the company becomes. And eventually, those decisions reach a point where the business itself has to change. Maybe that's what resetting Xbox really means. Not abandoning everything the company spent years building, but recognizing that growth alone isn't enough. At some point, every ambitious company has to ask a different question. Not how do we become bigger, but how do we make everything we've built sustainable? And maybe that's the real story behind Xbox's layoffs. Not that Microsoft suddenly changed direction, but that years of expansion had finally reached a point where the company needed to rethink how all of those pieces fit together. Because the layoffs were never really the story, they were simply the moment the story became impossible to ignore.